To myself, hi, my name is Adam Daw. I've been working on the Salesforce platform since 2008. Done quite a bit. I started with Service Cloud, or what was at that point, or what Service Cloud became. And most recently, I've been spending most of my time either speaking, teaching, or researching about the more recent aspects and features of Salesforce, and specifically around how we use it with all of these AI tools that are coming out over the past few years. So this isn't a survey of AI tools, and it's not a prediction about what's going to be coming. What this is I want to give you a map of how we can use the aspects of what make us particularly interesting as humans and apply those to our work with the AI tools that are available. So I've categorized it into 5 points that I'm calling the 5 C's. And by the end of my little talk here, I think that you'll be able to apply at least one of them before this week is out in your work with these tools. Now, the honest starting point is that AI tools are genuinely useful. There is work that can be simplified by using and leveraging these tools. So this isn't necessarily a skeptical talk. I know I've shipped work in the past 18 months that I wouldn't have shipped without using Claude or Codex or Cursor or what have you, and or even Gemini in the ways that it's been useful. And all of that is also leveraged inside of Salesforce through Agentforce and Einstein AI, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the conversation about how to use them well typically boils down to, yes? Is there a question there? Okay. Typically boils down to the same thing. Human creativity and our human judgment is what we're really bringing to the table, and something that AI cannot really defeat, right? And that's true, but it's not necessarily descriptive. It's not really actionable. How do we apply human creativity? How do we apply human judgment when we're using these AI tools to help us get the best work out of them? So that's what we're going to talk about today. And that's what the 5 C's, in my opinion, are. They are constraints, narrowing the output space; context, supplying what the model doesn't have access to; curation, deciding what is worth sharing of the model, what's worth keeping, and what we should be discarding; conceptualization, framing not only the question that we're asking, but making sure that it's the right question; and then finally, how all four of those connect to that crucial creativity that we've talked about. So each of these is actually a pretty broad topic. You could say that each of these is essentially discipline in their own right, but they are what allow us to turn our AI use into something that's really an accelerant for whatever we're actually working with. It turns AI from a replacement tool to a force multiplier. So let's talk about constraints first. And these are initially just going to be some broad descriptions of each of the 5 categories. Then we'll see how they apply specifically to admins working within Salesforce, and then also developers. So first off, constraints. When we think of generative models, when we're talking about ChatGPT or Agentforce or Claude, what we're really dealing with is this massive space of possible outputs, these giant tables of parameters. And the way that I like to think about constraints is that they don't actually restrict the space that we're dealing with. They help us to narrow down the neighborhood where we're going to find our answers. The way I like to describe this often is, if you think of a generative AI like a giant table of multiplication factors and products. So every potential multiplication problem you can think of is on this massive table. But we know that we're specifically looking for one mathematics problem. We don't remember exactly what we're looking for, but we know that we're looking for something that will multiply out to the answer 8. That already restricts our space significantly. Now let's say that we remember that we're also looking for 3 factors that work out to the product of 8. Again, we've narrowed it down. Here, we no longer have 1 times 8 or 2 times 4. We have 3 separate integers, and we know that we're only looking in positive space. So again, we're narrowing that down. But we could still be dealing with 1 times 1 times 8, or 2 times 2 times 2, or 1 times 2 times 4. And then we remember that we want each integer to only be used once. And that is what allows us to get to the result we were initially looking for. 1 times 2 times 4 is equal to 8. So each of these narrowings, each of these restrictions allow us to narrow down the neighborhood of the answers that we're looking for. So these constraints don't restrict the space that we're working with arbitrarily. They allow us to narrow down the neighborhood where every answer we want, we can actually find. And this, in our broader perspective, is our tests, it's our specifications, it's our requirements. The thing we have to remember about a lot of these tools is that they are non-deterministic. We can have the same request and desire the same outcome, but we're going to end up with a different approach depending on how we ask it, based on a number of factors, and not all of those parameters are ones that we have immediate insight into. So by defining our endpoint, when we know that we've actually arrived, be it through test classes or acceptance criteria, we can make sure that the model stops and it doesn't continue to try to spin or hallucinate until it gives us something completely unexpected. It makes sure that we stop chasing one right answer, but we say anything that meets all of these requirements can actually get us there. I like to think of if anybody here is familiar with the Oulipo school of writers, the whole concept around that was that by providing constraints, we could actually boost or bolster our creativity. Georges Perec, for example, wrote an entire novel without using the letter E. And by providing that challenge of that limit, it actually generated an opportunity for creativity. Now let's talk about context, our second C. I want to be precise about what type of context I'm talking about. Most people, when they hear context, especially if they've been working with AI tools more recently, will think of the context window, what the model can actually keep in mind at any given point in time. And that's important, but that's not necessarily the most interesting type of context we can think of. The operating context is, the system prompts and the persona framing and all the available tools inside of its harness, what makes an agent an agent. And that's also very important. And we've seen things like, additional skills or MCP connections that allow us to expand the functionality available to an agent. Again, not the most interesting application of the term context. The one that I want to focus on is institutional context. And this is the why behind a given system. So who the real stakeholders are, what has already been tried before you actually bring a problem to this AI tool, which decisions are off limits and have already been kind of set in stone. So this isn't just specifically what's available inside of the model's training set. It's information that might be contextual to your organization. Maybe why you dropped a specific tool back in 2023. You decided as an organization to stop using Redis, and you need the AI to know not to try to recommend that again. That's the context that we, as the human in the loop, can provide that isn't necessarily available to our AI tools. That being said, all of the context that we have may not necessarily be useful for the problem in question. And long context, going back to that context window from the first definition of context, is expensive. So you want to make sure that it is the relevant context that we're providing, as opposed to just a purely abundant context. And that's where curation comes into play. Curation has two different types as well. The acute kind, which is before you're opening an agentic session, when you're deciding which files you're going to include, which notes you're going to surface, which past context you want to actually carry forward. And here it's about restraint, not about abundance, as I was talking about before. You want to make sure that you're spending more time removing things from the available context and adding them in. And then there's the durable kind of curation, where you have long-running knowledge bases that are probably too large for your agent to work with in the given context. This is, your docs, your decision records, your team handbooks. And your agent can reach into those, but they can't have the entire context of months or years of the time it's taken to tend to this information resource um, all at once. That being said, if you have a well tended knowledge base, that's absolutely a beneficial piece of context and content that's going to compound its utility over time. But a neglected knowledge base is potentially full of things, but it might not be useful. It's kind of like an old attic. It's got lots of stuff, but most of the time you're going to be spending it sorting through everything that's in there until you find the one or two useful pieces. And that can really eat into your sessions and your work with any of these tools. So the hardest part of curation, either our acute or durable creation, is what is actually worth keeping. And that is not something that automation can decide for you. That really requires us to make these decisions. Now let's talk about the fourth C, conceptualization. This is one I often think about the most because the agent, whatever it might be, will faithfully solve whatever problem we give it. And the question is whether or not we've handed it the right problem. If we look at these three examples, right, we need a search bar, or we need more reporting, or our test coverage is too low, we need more test cases. Oftentimes we'll find, and this is not unique to using AI, if anybody's worked in professional services or even just building things for internal clients, you'll find that often the question isn't building whatever people ask for, it's making sure that we're asking for the right things. But with the increase in agent capability, the cost of the wrong frame doesn't fall, it actually increases because we're removing those barriers that prevent us from building something we never actually needed. We need to make sure that we are getting the framing right before we decide to start to build functionality. So that search bar, maybe we actually need a search bar, or maybe we have an information architecture problem that we need to figure out. Do we actually need more reporting, or do we have a problem with the measurements that we're actually set up? Do we have an issue where we're reporting the wrong things as opposed to not reporting enough? Do we actually have a test case problem, or do we have a code problem where the actual code that we have is not testable, and we need to look at refactoring? So as tools get more capable, the cost of a wrong frame goes up. It's easy to start building the wrong solutions because we're not stopping and asking if we have the right problem. And that all boils down to our fifth C, or in creativity. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the works of Bowden from 1990, where we're talking about the types of creativity. But there are three primary types of creativity: combinatorial, which is novel combinations of familiar items. So this is combining two things that we already have into new and interesting formats. Your chocolate and peanut butter, for example. Exploratory is pushing the boundaries of what we already know. So we have an example and we're pushing it a little bit further than what is currently understood. That first type, combinatorial, this is something that the current AI tools are actually quite good at. This is essentially what they're built for. And they're starting to get better at this exploratory aspect as well. But it's this third type, the transformational creativity, that requires the types of intuitive leaps and associative understanding that fundamentally AI is not designed to do. And so this is where human intelligence really brings something to the table. And it applies to our other four C's, the things that maybe aren't necessarily in our immediate context, but provide an additional set of information that would never have been exposed initially. So now let's see how this actually applies when we're talking about our work inside Salesforce. The first thing we need to understand is that the way that AI tools are structured and the way a human mind is structured, these vary to an incredible degree. A model has been designed with an enormous training set, but this training set is going to have its solutions densely centered based on where all those different training sets overlap. And as you get out to the edges, the predictability of what you're going to receive and the confidence level of what we actually see is going to thin significantly. And furthermore, a an AI tool cannot provide information that isn't inside of its training set. I was having a conversation with an AI tool recently, and we kept running into the barrier that what I was dealing with was a lot more recent than the edge of its training set, which was in August of 2025. It's trying to talk about modern events or a recent paper that had been released, and it didn't have any information on it. So I had to feed all of that into the context before we could even get up and running. A human, on the other hand, has a much narrower volume of understanding because it's all experiential. It's lived and it has been essentially designed as a large associative set that isn't necessarily neatly categorized. But that is a set of information that we can provide when we're working with one of these tools, and the overlap between the two ways of understanding things and the juxtaposition of these two different ways of understanding things can allow us to build out even better results. So lean into that asymmetry. That's where that human, narrower, uncatalogued reach can start to surpass that model's huge but bounded understanding. So let's talk about how this specifically ties into our work with Salesforce. We're going to start with admins. So again, we're going to go through these 5 C's as they apply to admin work. So here's our scenario. This is for constraints. We're configuring a next best action functionality in Service Cloud, but without specifying valid recommendation types or eligible record types, and one specific rule. For example, here, the do not surface a case is closed. The model starts to suggest functionality that reads like it follows, and it should suit our purposes, but actually confuses the agents because it doesn't understand what we were looking for specifically. We have to define what our pick list values and record types for our prompt builder instructions were before we start to actually run our prompt. We set explicit must not rules. Don't suggest that you do X in whatever situation. Finally, we have to use our validation rules as a constraint checklist. These are already built-in features and functionality inside of Salesforce that we can apply as part of our process. And also test with our edge case records. Don't just go for our happy path, but look at the scenarios that may cause the standard process to fail. So pick list values, record types, service level agreements, these rules that are already built into the metadata inside of our org, these are available constraints. These are automatically available for our use inside of our Salesforce work. And using them explicitly in our prompts will help to make sure that we get better, more accurate results. Now let's talk about context. The model that you're dealing with, whatever it might be, has, again, built on a large training set, and that probably includes a lot of the out-of-the-box documentation. So if you ask, for example, the Einstein functionality to summarize an account, and it provides a fluent paragraph, but it ignores that the account in question was a QA record and has a do not contact flag, and that the actual primary contact on that account has left the company. That institutional context is not something that the tool can have immediately. And this isn't just about your organization's workings, but your actual Salesforce organization as well. So documenting all of your field usage, making sure that the metadata is properly populated around not just how a field is used, but why a field is used. Note exceptions, which profiles skip which rules or which record types behave differently than in the standard process. Flag your stale or your test data if you need to keep it in the org for some reason, so that the model doesn't include that or misread that as real business data. And brief the AI on recent org changes, migrations, restructures, maybe people who still have user records in the system because there's a longer offboarding process, but that shouldn't be considered as active for one reason or another. So that institutional context, the why behind the way that your data model is laid out, the way that your metadata is established, that lives in your head, probably not in the training set or what the model has access to immediately. So surface it explicitly when you're building out your prompts. Now let's talk about curation. Your prompt builder templates might reference, for example, a case escalation path that was restructured 6 months ago. And the AI is building out to follow those instructions, and then the users get rerouted to a team that no longer handles that type of case. So our prompts and our templates need to be audited and adapted and updated when business processes change, not just when the issues actually show up. We need to make sure that we're curating not only what we provide to the model when we're working with it directly, but everything that it relies on. So deprecate outdated flow documentation that could end up in the AI context, for example. Or if you give it access to a repository and you haven't updated your README file in a while. Maintain a short AI context brief for each major process, maybe a one-pager, but as part of your ongoing process, make sure that that's current. And also decide what stays out of the AI context as deliberately as what goes in. It doesn't need to know everything, and it shouldn't, especially on different projects. So treat your prompt builder instructions and your Einstein configuration documents like living process documents. Review them on a regular schedule, not just when problems arise. So that's our third C. Now let's talk about conceptualization. So this is, again, going back to that concept of asking whether a problem is what it actually appears to be. So a VP asks you to add an AI-generated account summary to every account page, and you start configuring that in Prompt Builder. But the better question is, why do your representatives need this summary? Is it because they can't find the data? Then maybe the problem is actually a page layout issue and not a missing AI feature, even though it might be fun to actually build it. My recommendation would be to run a 5 whys before you start opening any AI configuration tool or any prompt builder. Validate that request against the actual user pain point, not just what was immediately asked. And then check whether there's another solution, better data hygiene, whether a better report or a simpler flow would solve it first. Because even if the cost of AI use is going down, it is still expensive when compared to out-of-the-box features. Document the problem statement before you specify the solution and make sure that it's reviewable and people agree with your understanding of what the problem actually is. So is it an AI problem? Is it a data problem? Is it a process problem? And depending on the answer, you may need to change your actual approach. Finally, our fifth C for administrator work inside Salesforce, creativity. We've got a new Einstein feature that's been announced, and every admin at every company has access to the same documentation. This is all in the latest release notes. So the admin who designs the most effective implementation is going to be the one who knows how their users actually work, not just immediately applying this new feature, but how is that going to play into the workarounds and shortcuts and pain points that the users inside your org currently possess. We can use AI well to generate options, and then we should use our own understanding of our org and our users to evaluate and select the best solutions. The best AI configurations are going to be those that combine features with our own context, undocumented user behavior. While it's true, like I said earlier, that capabilities have increased significantly, what this really means is that prototyping has become a lot easier. So we can prototype rapidly with a model, and then we can apply our judgment to see what actually fits. Finally, documentation. The admin who documents their creative decisions is going to leave a more durable org, and this will pay dividends in the future. So it's not about inspiration in this specific context, it's about recombination, that first type of creativity I was talking about. Your institutional knowledge combined with what is available in the training data and the documentation can give you something that is greater than the sum of its parts. So that is our 5 Cs as applied to administrators inside of Salesforce. Now let's look at those same disciplines applied to developer work. The actual,
Hey,
yep.
Just give you a break a little before you go. If anybody has any reflection of what Adam was talking?
Sure. Yeah, let's talk. Anybody have any questions specifically around either the first section, so the general 5 Cs application, or specifically around administrator work?
Any how this resonate with you guys? I'm thinking about you, Stuart. You are lead of the Service Cloud AI future state.
When you talk about, and I think it was under curation, you were talking about your knowledge base and for admins. Is this like, are you connecting your vibes to your Git repo to understand the code base, or like what exactly do you mean by the knowledge there?
When I'm talking about knowledge base here, I'm not talking about any specific, Salesforce feature. I'm not talking about, Service Cloud knowledge base or even the code repository. I'm talking about your collective understanding of how things work at your organization.
No, just because, yeah, like I was curious about the, because you hit some good points about context windows and just like entire knowledge base if it's in a long form.
Right.
So one of the things that we're looking at is like, how can we stage our knowledge in some form of like summaries or relevant information, so you're not hitting those context windows, but still to cohesively take in like the entire code base or like an architecture approach from maybe like a Confluence page.
Right.
But you can't, because you end up like it's a hard problem, but I think
it is, but I think that there's a couple of different ways that you can approach it. I think that one of the most useful I've seen is to have a good organization for your overall knowledge base. If you're using Confluence or what have you, a good table of contents, making sure that individual files don't really hit larger than 200 lines unless absolutely necessary, especially if they're going to be loaded into context. But giving the model a good way to navigate your overall code knowledge base, starting with a good index, is the way that I've seen be most successful so far. There are, however, a number of different tools that people have been working on in the broader space here for how to solve this problem. Mind mappings, graphs, a number of different MCP connections, and they have different potential weights or context implications. So it's a problem that hasn't been completely solved, and we're seeing a bunch of different approaches right now in the overall space.
Yeah. Liking the Carpathy's LLM wiki design
That's an
pattern.
example. Yeah.
It's like it's challenging to build, and would maybe take this C out of the human capacity and put it into the AI column. But yeah,
I wouldn't. Honestly, I don't think that you'll ever be able to completely take this C out of the human column, because even if you provide a good wiki the way that Karpathy is describing in his skill, that's still only what's been completely documented, and it doesn't actually cover any of the broader institution, maybe a conversation at a business meeting 2 weeks ago that actually applies to whatever you're currently trying to implement. In the back of a napkin sketch that has been, decided this is V2 final, as opposed to whatever's in the spec document. The work that we do as a broader industry is a lot broader than what ends up in our official knowledge base, and that's not going to change.
Okay. You're right, but and now we're stepping outside the point of this presentation, but I agree completely because you would utilize the transcript from that meeting as your raw source that informs that knowledge base, and it shouldn't like knowledge won't be this like inviolate corporate thing. It'll become a living knowledge base that is informed by these meetings and decisions. But anyways, I'm taking you off track. I think you want to get to the developer side of things, unless you want to address that.
If somebody has another question, then I'm happy to answer it. But other than that, I'll move on after. All I would say was that's great if that transcript exists in your database or in your knowledge base. But we come back to our context window, and our context is still finite. The model cannot have everything that's happened in the entirety of our organization in its context at any given point in time. And it won't know necessarily to search for something that our associative brains and understanding might surface without prompting. Does that make sense?
But
it does. But I mean,
it makes sense.
That's an answer.
I just want to say this loud. We are surfacing here that as much as they tell us that artificial intelligence is powerful, it has big gaps in human knowledge that is flying around, that is not documented anywhere, that is living in anecdotal spaces around, and it's influencing business. When I formulate this like this, Adam, does this resonate with your kind of finding? What you were trying to tell us?
That was one of the things I mentioned. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And despite best efforts, we can try to have everything recorded, but I don't think we're ever going to. That's always going to be aspirational.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
More questions? You can go to be developer now.
All right, we've only got 5 slides left. We're almost done. So when we're applying constraints as a developer, this is where we need to think about when we started working in Apex development, in governor limits were introduced. For those of us who had been developing in, let's say, broader Java or C#, governor limits were new and strange, but ultimately they allow us to provide a better structure for our code, and some people would argue they made better developers, specifically when they're working inside Salesforce. But these types of governor limits and bulkification requirements that are required for developing inside of the Salesforce ecosystem are things that should be brought to the awareness of our tools. And some of them are already there. They're part of the existing context, but they could also be part of, let's say, your Claude.md or a broader constitution file. If you've got specific trigger handler patterns that you're using, the metadata trigger framework or financial force libraries, you want these to be available to your prompting before it starts to try to generate code. So treat your Salesforce governor limits, your naming conventions, your framework rules as the first constraints you apply before any code actually gets written, as opposed to having to go through iteration after iteration as it runs into whatever your checks and balances might be. C2 for developers, context. When your agentic tool is writing a new utility class for you, it might do so beautifully, but it's also going to break 3 managed package integrations that you never mentioned because they weren't in the file that you were sharing. The model had no way to know that those existed. Your context session, whatever you provide, is the model's entire world. What you don't put in it, it can't account for. So architecture notes, references to your overall structure, developer guides, as long as they're not too large, those are the types of things that you want to provide as context. If you have a specific trigger framework that you're leveraging, reference it explicitly. Don't assume the model will be able to retrieve it. And if you have do not touch classes that you do not want it to try to make modifications to, highlight those as well. So let's move on to curation. Yes? Was that a question there?
Oh, keep going.
All right. Curation. So you are building a new piece of code and you paste in your entire classes directory so that it has everything it needs as you're building. And it produces code that happens to blend patterns from 3 different eras of your code base because it had access to all of them and didn't know it wasn't meant to use something from 5 years ago. This is where we need to start to build out that curation again. Isolate the current patterns and relevant schema that we wanted to actually use, remove deprecated classes and older migration scripts if we don't want to see these leveraged. So you should start each session with the 2 to 3 files that are most relevant to the current task. And make sure that your Claude MD is recording your current architectural decisions, and then you go back and keep that refreshed. Curation is as important before a session as the prompt itself. Decide what earns a place inside of your context window. Conceptualization. You're asked to provide more test coverage, going back to our original example. So you hand the task to an agentic tool and you get 200 new test methods in an hour. Fantastic, coverage goes up. But the tests don't actually assert anything meaningful because the real problem is that the code was test resistant, not that the code was untested. So if you are able to identify and frame your problem statement before you actually start coding, you can surface what the actual request is. So this is a reiteration of what we were discussing about before. If a request is ambiguous from a stakeholder, reframe it, write it, and confirm before building. You can also use the agent to explore the problem space first, do a couple of spikes. If you're trying to test what kind of feature you're trying to enable, you may be surprised by the results. In a recent piece of work I was working on, we were pulling from 3 or 4 different objects simultaneously to provide a holistic view. And I thought that it might be a good use of the GraphQL APIs inside Salesforce. But after a quick spike, it took me a couple of hours working with the agent tools to really plumb the depths of potential solution space. Turns out that a standard wire call from Salesforce was significantly faster than using GraphQL, which was a little counterintuitive. But we were able to figure this out quickly as opposed to after doing like a full sprint's worth of development. So reframing that problem space is upstream of the actual prompting. If you spend 10 minutes on the problem definition, you can save yourself hours of rework.
Your lips to God's ears.
Pardon?
I said from your lips to God's ears.
Yeah. Finally, the 5th C when it comes to development, creativity. So a model generates a technically correct integration pattern, but you might have seen that fail at 2 different organizations you were at prior to the current code base because of some platform ordering event that isn't documented well. I'm sure that some of you who've been working in Salesforce for a while know the types of gotchas I'm referring to. But you've seen it and you can recognize it, and so you point it out. The model would not have seen this based on its available training information. So that personal knowledge base, that patterns I've seen fail, or scenarios or solutions that look like they would work but don't for one reason or another, that's a creative edge that you can continue to maintain. And you can look at your AI-generated designs and compare them against this type of information. If you've got org-specific insights, you can contribute those back into the documentation. This compounds the advantage, right? We're snowballing. The AI will not make the same mistake twice if we're able to apply that into the documentation that it has access to. So treat code review of AI output as itself a creative act. If you're looking at the coded outputs, what would you do differently? And why would you do that? There's a great skill by Matt Pocock, the Grill Me skill, that is actually quite good. It goes through and it allows you to kind of investigate each of the potential edges of a problem set and see if you can really drill down into potential solutions or reasonings. I'd recommend you take a look at it. So the model is great for generation and iteration, but your experience will be useful for evaluation. Do not discount it. And that is our 5th C. So the most effective use of AI today is by combining what we bring to the table with what these tools are continuing to develop. And I hope that everybody remembers that as they keep working. We had a session for questions before. Does anybody have any questions about the developer section or anything that's come up since then?
Any developers in the room? No developers? Peter, you're a developer. Architect, developer.
Developer.
What do you think?
Most thing he's completely right. You have unique constraints. All these things you have to say, but often you hit the limits of the context window when you try it. So you need every time to compact all your when you're working with it, to use that the information is not too much. You have to be aware that only 60% of the answer will be correct.
Right.
It's not so much sometimes, and be aware that it can run into loops, and how to kick the LLM out of its problems.
That's right. It often requires careful observation as it's processing, and you can see its thought patterns. So if you're able to kind of look at that expanded view, you can often stop it before it gets to those points. But having an agent do some sort of development work is a lot more active than you might think. It requires somebody still there watching what's processing.
But what I found in my thinking, that where we need to switch, and you hit it on few points here, and one is you're dealing with 20 years or 25 years now, actually more, 27, of code base that was written by different frameworks, different people through the history with different standards, and it's still working in the org. Whatever it does it. Everybody's happy, kind of, with it.
Right.
Now you are giving agents to read this, judge it, make decision for future code base, and produce something totally unexpected or maybe totally great, whatever. In some ways, I see more challenges than benefits in agents. On another way, what we are making full cycle is, you need to change the way of thinking. If you think before 2000, people were doing waterfall. They go to the moon, they write the code, they test every single possible. They have written down every single scenario that's what can get wrong and what this space shuttle is going to do and get people back on the Earth. And then we move to the PC and Salesforce, no software, and agile everything, and proof of concept, and iterate, get me to the final product. Now we are back to the same waterfall that was working before 2000. Before you start go ahead.
So I was going to say, yeah, absolutely. Except instead of like 2 weeks of spec design, it's 2 hours of spec design. So it's the same steps, but a lot more truncated.
But knowledge that you need to use to write the specs, it's now dispersed around bigger people base or source or whatever. You need to have ways to collect all of this in order to feed agents back.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is what I'm seeing as kind of changing way of thinking and changing way of doing things in order to get something out of this that is
I think this is why we're seeing a lot more people talking about spec-driven development when it comes to these AI tools, because as opposed to purely test-driven or business-driven development, the spec becomes your kind of hard set rules that the agent needs to actually accomplish, that initial set of constraints. But people are arguing that specs are never perfect and they always need to be iterated on, which has created a number of conversations. we're going back to the same solutions and trying to find a different approach with new tool sets, which it's kind of an interesting space to be in right now. I've been working on a specific implementation called verified spec-driven development that has like specific gatings over the entire process and uses hard adversarial reviews to make sure that the documentation that we are building adheres to the initial requirements, that the tests adhere to the initial specification. If there is anything that has been called out later on in the process, that the rest of it has been up to date. And because the capabilities are increasing, that turnaround time, every time we need to iterate, that timeline is shortened significantly. Where it would have been prohibitively expensive to do this if we were doing it all manually, we can do these more granular process levels with these new tools.
Adam, can you talk about your like design pattern for that?
Yeah, totally. I've got a gist of it on GitHub. I can share it in the chat here if somebody wants to pull it out.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
I just want to say, like, the easiest way I have found to learn about AI, aside from whatever training Salesforce has on Trailhead, is from knowing and hiring AI nerds. Because I get to work with Adam now. They have entirely different ways of thinking that I would never have thought. Never in my life. It's just constant learning about how that type of development, like AI-enabled development. And to your point, Nash, the stupid intern should never make decisions, right? It is. I treat my cloud like a stupid intern. It asked for like a summary, and it took the first 20 records and gave me a summary. I was like, I told you to do that. Well, oh yeah, my mistake. So get yourself an AI nerd, because just mountains of different ways of thinking, especially from like I'm an admin, I'm a consultant, I'm a solutions architect, but teach me every day.
So I just shared the link on the chat here. So if anybody, if you have access to that, great. If not, I'm happy to send it out afterwards. I'm not sure the exact on the user group community or whatever it might be. Does that help?
Yeah.
Perfect.
That's thank you.
You bet. Well, that's it for me.
Thank you, Adam.
You bet.
My baby. I will stop recording, Adam. Thank you. We'll pause this.